work right now. Okay, so let's just dive right in. We have so much to get to. I'm so excited. Hopefully the first of many hangs, as I call them on here. So this is going to be super informal and fun, at least, you know, for all of us, because we're all into music and stuff. Anyway, Finlandia is such a cool piece, and there's so much that goes into this piece that I think really defines why we play music, why we love music. It's full of everything. And so I really wanted to get us going on these, using that piece as a guide, because there's so much to talk about. So the documents I sent you, you'll see one that says Finland Maps. And you may be wondering, why on earth is there a document of Finland maps that he sent us? Well, obviously the name Finlandia refers to Finland, which is where Sibelius is from. And so the history of this piece really begins with the beginning of Finland. When Sibelius was born, Finland as a country didn't exist. But that was kind of the whole point of this piece coming into existence. And so the story of Sibelius as a composer is tied directly to the rise of Finland as a country. So the first thing we're going to do actually is dive a little bit into the history of the country and the history of the composer. So the first document I'd love you to open is the timeline. And that's a really quick, you'll see it. For those of you that can't open that document, I'm going to share my screen right now so you can see it. Okay, does everybody see my screen right now? Just give me thumbs up if you got it. So those of you that can't open can see it here. So we're going to start kind of in 1809, but I'm going to also just jump back earlier if we need to. So 1809, Sweden loses Finland to Russia. At this point, Finland was under Swedish occupation, pretty much for a long time in history. That's how it was for about 300 years. And this was in the Finnish War. Obviously, thanks to Napoleon, he kind of caused a lot of issues in Europe, didn't he? But then as time went on, the Kalevala was published in 1849. You may have heard of the Kalevala already. So many different aspects of Finnish culture were impacted by this. It's basically the most important piece of literature to come out of Finland. But right around this time, there was no kind of surprise that it was also the most nationalistic piece of literature. It was the first one to really highlight the Finnish language. At this point, the territory of Finland, everyone spoke Swedish. It was the official language. It was the language of the government and the courts. So the Kalevala was really the first one to highlight Finnish language. It also inspired a lot of people, composers included. A number of Finnish composers started writing works about the Kalevala, about literature, about Finnish folklore. That's what the Kalevala is actually about. It's about mythology, folklore, a lot of cool pieces out of it. And actually, the first composer to really highlight it was a guy by the name of Robert Kajanis. Has anyone heard that name before? Kajanis. So Robert Kajanis was a really important conductor, but he was also one of the first people to bring Sibelius's music out into the mainstream, and he made it hugely popular. So we're going to talk about Kajanis a little bit too. But so anyway, 16 years later, after the Kalevala is published, Sibelius is born. His father was a doctor, a physician. He was the army garrison surgeon and things like that. So, but unfortunately, a year later, there's the Great Finnish Famine. Notice there, the Great Finnish Famine. And I think around 270,000 people perished during that, and it was agricultural. The climate had changed a little bit. It was kind of a disaster, and that led to a lot of issues with obviously availability for food, but also the cleanliness of food, hygiene, things like that. And as a result, his father actually passed away in 1868 when he was just 3 years old. So this was a massively impactful moment for Sibelius, who would then grow up in a largely female household. Grew up with his mom, his grandmother, and his aunts. So it was pretty much him and those parental figures for him. And this is, like I said, a very abbreviated timeline, but it's hopefully going to impact our study of Finlandia. So jump ahead 30 years later, we're skipping a whole lot of Sibelius's life, but the Tsar of Russia greatly restricted Finnish freedoms in what was called the Grand Duchy of Finland. Why is that important? Well, notice in the same year, the piece we're studying, the piece we're playing, Finlandia, was composed. Absolutely not a coincidence there. And we'll dive into why Finlandia was composed for what purpose in a second. But just know that this political oppression was a huge kind of catalyst for Sibelius's writing and also just for the country in general. This led to increased kind of tension and strife. And then in 1917, at the end of World War I, Finland declared independence from Russia. A civil war broke out. Not great times. Finally, they did acquire independence for the first time in their history. In 1918, they existed as an independent country, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously, Sibelius was born into a very specific time in Finnish history. It didn't exist as a country, and really thanks to the growth of culture, art, literature, and music during his lifetime, the country was propelled into its own existence. He became a very instrumental figure in the creation of Finland because of the impact of his music, of course, but also his usage of the Kalevala, his work with Kajanis and the Helsinki Orchestra. It became synonymous that the rise of Finnish culture was also the rise of Sibelius, and those two were hand in hand, which is why we always associate him so heavily with the idea of nationalism, patriotism, and the impact music can have on society. So that's a very brief explanation of that. And actually, just to highlight how this all looked in history, I want to just open the Finland maps so you get a sense of what I'm talking about here. And so you can all see my screen, I'm assuming still, yes. Cool, so I'm gonna be just highlighting here. Notice this is the year 815, so we're going like way back in the day. So here is Finland, what would later become Finland, a land of many lakes, things like that. At this point, not really much to say, but notice this little area right here, Swedes and Goths. As we all know, the Holy Roman Empire began to grow in size, and things, Christianity began to spread, had a huge impact on the development of Europe. It came through here into Scandinavia. And Sweden was the first kingdom to adopt Christianity and would later start adopting and kind of gathering all these little areas here. The Northmen, which later become Norway, aptly named, it was really Viking territory, as you can call it. Anyway, jumping ahead, I want you to remember this is where Finland is in Scandinavia. Let's jump down here. This is the year 1328. So I just mentioned that Sweden was the first one to have Christianity and try to spread it throughout Scandinavia. Well, they had something called the Swedish Crusades. We've heard that word crusade before, but in a very different part of the world. And so the Swedes actually had their own crusades, and they went into this territory here, which was the same exact territory, that's Finnish territory. There's also an area named called Karelia. You may have heard of Karelia. Sibelius has a Karelia suite. It refers to a specific place in Finland that is right around here. It's kind of the bridge between Finland and Russia. Anyway, so just keep in mind this area here, and you'll notice the sphere of influence on both of these sides and why it's going to be important when we talk about Finlandia, the music itself. Okay, this is a bit of a confusing map, so I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. This is the Swedish Empire from 1560 to 1660. So notice how large this became. The green is all Sweden at one point. Here's Karelia by itself, and here's Finland. Okay, so the years in parentheses refer to when Sweden eventually lost all these territories. But I just want you to notice the sphere of influence that Sweden had over Finland. And this is as early as 1560. So that is back in the day. So for 300 years or thereabout, Finland was directly under the kind of the impact of Swedish rule. In 1809, though, sorry, I'm jumping ahead by one page. 1721, let's talk about the Great Northern War, between Finland and Sweden. Sort of a first kind of cry at like, we want to kind of be our own thing, and it was between Russia and Sweden. Very kind of weird time, but notice the green parts here, Karelia again, a very, very, very important part of Finland, went back to Russia. Finns didn't like that very much. So there's a strife and tension between Sweden and Russia already existing. I'm giving you a very abbreviated history lesson here. Okay, this is a really cool old map. And it's a map of Norway and Sweden. Norway is highlighted in yellow. That's the borders of Norway. And Sweden has all three of these little territories: green, red, blue. Not important what they represent, they're just territories. But now I want you to notice, where's Finland? This is the year 1845 already. So after the Finnish War, Finland became a part of Russia. So from one occupier to another, not really fun times if you're growing in Finland. And this is 1845, so 20 years before Sibelius was born. So you can imagine I'm trying to set the stage here for what the impact was politically, culturally in Finland at the time of his birth. About 56 years after they were handed over from Sweden to Russia as part of a deal after a war. Not fond of this occupied status. There's a increased cry for kind of independence. And I mentioned the famine on the other timeline, kind of an important moment also because the famine, what it did was kind of make people aware that like, hey, why are this could have been avoided. Why did the government not help us more? And so increased cries for like, maybe we should have our own thing here. So Sibelius was born into this exact kind of melting pot, like almost like a powder keg of things about to happen. We always hear the phrase, luck is the meeting point between opportunity and preparation. Well, Sibelius's place as a composer was kind of solidified in that regard because the timing was pretty lucky, but he was also pretty prepared as a composer himself. So we don't have to talk about that right now, but I wanted you to at least see what this looked like when Sibelius was born, okay? All right, so let me stop sharing here. Okay, so let's dive back into Sibelius himself. He was born in 1865. I mentioned a few things there, but really Sibelius's upbringing and musical training was split between two spheres of influence, German and Russian. So he greatly admired Russian composers like Rimsky-Korsakov and Tchaikovsky. Those were his two main kind of who he admired, really respected. He actually wanted to study with Rimsky-Korsakov. He thought of him as a brilliant orchestrator. His use of colors or woodwind instruments, and especially, was pretty like something he really, really admired greatly. So, but that being said, remember what the situation was at the time he was born. Finland was occupied by Russia. To go and want to study there would have been a kind of a big faux pas nationally. So his sphere of influence was really German. He grew up and then went on to study in Berlin and Vienna. I think he spent about 2 to 3 years there when he was in his mid-20s. So he studied in Berlin and Vienna. He learned a lot of German techniques of composition, and he learned a lot of German structure in the way he wrote things, which is why his success as a symphonist was pretty apparent, because he was able to just do that very readily thanks to his German training. And then he would use his Russian influence of folk melodies, colors, woodwind, sonorities, things like that, and it would kind of melt into this one idea. Now you add the Kalevala and other folk melodies he would hear, his great love for his home country, folk melodies he was hearing, add the nationalistic spice into it, and you have a really unique blend that would become Sibelius's music. So I'm going to just jump ahead a little bit. So let's just talk about the year 1899. We already mentioned that the Tsar was restricting power. The year 1899 was also the year that he wrote his first symphony. Now, why is that important for us? Well, I'm going to just show you the opening page of the first symphony. And I want you to look at the meter, cut time. I also want you to look at what instrument begins the symphony. There's 2 instruments that begin the first symphony of Sibelius: the clarinet, sorry, I'm covering the name, and the timpani. A massive, massive clarinet solo begins the very first symphony of Sibelius. Right away, we have an idea of what he favors as far as the beginning of his, what he feels a voice is. Not surprisingly, out of his 9 symphonies, that's correct, I said 9, 7 numbered symphonies, and there's also a Kullervo and a Lemminkainen, which are considered to be symphonies. Out of those 9, 6 begin with a woodwind melody. 6 out of 9. So 2/3 of his symphonies begin with that. That's pretty important. Why? I want you to, if you have your part or if you have your full score for Finlandia, go ahead and open that up. And I want you to look at the opening of Finlandia, who plays, and it's brass. Pretty important thing here. So while we do that, I want us to open, where's that document? The third one I sent you, the Sibelius and Finlandia analysis. Do we all have that one? Just show me a thumbs up if you can't open it. I want to just see how many of you can't open it still. Okay, 1, 2. Okay, so I'm going to open this up. I'm going to share my screen again so you can see this, because this is a pretty handy document, and this will just serve you in general if you're ever playing any Sibelius and want to have a quick reference guide. Oh, I thought I shared it. Here we go. Cool. All right, so here's the analysis document. So let's talk about the general things first of all. His influences, we already mentioned, German, Russian, native. I've already said all these things. We're not going to avoid that. Now, in general, as his use of sonority indicates, very heavily influenced by Russian music, which is known for its dark, rich, kind of luscious writing. So too was his. He uses a lot of low instrumentation, bassoons, cellos, bass clarinets, basses. That's really his bread and butter. They had great emphasis, massive amounts of attention. There's a lot of solos given to those instruments. But as a result, because things are generally sitting in that kind of range, whenever he used instruments like the flutes, like the trumpets, that had this really brilliant color to them, they had even more of an impact and effect because he used them in a bit sparingly, but also at specific moments to really highlight certain emotions and certain things. For example, and in this document, I often refer to specific spots in Finlandia. So let's actually look at one of those moments right now. Let's look at letter I in Finlandia. If you're looking at the full score, I believe it's page 17. But essentially, it's after this massive buildup. All the strings have the chromatic, this big, massive chord crescendo, and then all of a sudden at letter I, everything drops out except this accompaniment in the strings that's very, very light, pianissimo, and then a woodwind choir comes in. Really the first time the flute has an idea that's something other than a trill or an accompaniment figure or doubling. Massively important moment. And really you can look at this, and even though it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 voices playing, it's really an SATB choir. And I want you to notice I think if you scroll down in your document, yeah. So we'll talk about this in the woodwinds, but in general, there's a soprano, an alto, a tenor, and a bass. And that's highlighted under letter B, woodwinds. You'll see that there when we get to it. But anyway, I just wanted to point that out because it's a brilliant moment, and you really, really characteristically hear the flute in this spot more than anything else because you haven't really heard it as a feature. So anyway, let's see here. Another really important aspect of Sibelius, anytime he has melodic writing, again, very similar to Russian writing, it's meant to convey a very generalized repertoire of human emotions and feelings. Finlandia is no exception, which is why it is so powerful. All the melodic writing in Finlandia is very much specifically conveying a very specific emotion. So that being said, I want to just touch a little bit about his choices and his characteristics that make him such a unique composer. So strings, let's talk about strings really quickly. And again, I'm going to mention Finlandia. This is kind of our analysis, kind of just talking through the piece a little bit. He was a highly skilled violinist. He actually gave up a career as a concert violinist when he was 27, focused all of his attention on composing. Why is that important? Well, when he was 27 is 1892. It's when he wrote his first massive symphony, thankfully for us, because that's really when he began to write big, meaty compositions. So that being said, his training as a string player meant his writing was usually very effective, very, very sonorous, and also he knew exactly what these instruments were capable of. So he wouldn't just give them melody, or he wouldn't just give them this choral setting like Brahms is known for doing. He would in fact use them for very specific ideas, effects like trills, tremolos, things like that. So under C here, violin's not given the melody as often as other composers, very specifically so. I don't know if you guys remember, but when we did the Fifth Symphony, how often did the violins have the melody? Really not often at all. That's actually the case in Finlandia as well. If you look at the opening of Finlandia, after letter A, seventh bar of A is really one of the only times that the first violins come in with a very strong melody. Not only in this piece, but also in a lot of Sibelius's writing. Go ahead and look at the seventh bar of A. It's really a response to what the woodwinds just had, but it's a very powerful figure. We'll talk a little bit more about what that represents in a second. Okay, the use of tremolos in the strings, very, very important. Look at letter D now in Finlandia. Cellos and basses have this seemingly unimportant figure. It's these 16th note tremolos in a very low range. Cellos, that's the very kind of base of your range. I mean, open C to a D flat on a forte. It's meant to represent something brooding and sinister, but also notice nothing is changing in the texture. There's this fanfare on the brass, but everything else is static. The harmony doesn't change. Nothing really changes. It's very static, and he does it for a very specific purpose. It's meant to give the impression of activity and movement. Something is still happening even though the harmony is not moving. And this may seem insignificant, but there are so many times in his music that this happens. And in Finlandia, we see it very clearly. Often these 5 bars of just kind of static tremolo after D, 1, 2, 3, starting in the 3rd bar of D, often so uncomfortable for many orchestras and conductors because it's just 5 bars of nothing. But yet really what you're supposed to do is just give it the impression of activity. Very, very unique Sibelius device. So the next thing is something called cross-hatching, which is doubling notes on alternating pitches. This is all over his music. It's one of his musical footprints. In fact, we did this, I don't know if you guys remember, the string players, we talked about this in our string rehearsal after letter N. For violas and the first violins, the 5th bar, this figure, the I had us do it as you can do it either way, but really if you do it it's something that is very typically Sibelius. And the reason we didn't end up doing that is because I read an article later on, it doesn't matter. But this idea, especially the way it's written in the score, is a very typical Sibelius thing. Notice this chord change, triple F, E major on the and of 3 in the 4th bar of letter N. The first time we have an E major chord in the piece, and again, it's just static, nothing's moving, except these da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So it's meant to convey that there's still an energy and an expectation about something's gonna happen here. Something is clearly still building up, even though it feels like a resolution. So it's not done yet. Very typical rhythmic device, which again gives Sibelius his signature kind of energy. Okay, let's talk about the 16th as an accompaniment figure. So look at letter F. Okay, and I want you to look at what the strings have here. Pretty much everyone except the basses has 16th notes. He kind of gives you these fragments of melody, and all of a sudden 16th note accompaniment, fragment of melody, accompaniment. He just seamlessly goes back and forth. And it's our job to automatically know when am I accompaniment, when am I melody. Sometimes the 16th notes are melody, sometimes they're accompaniment. Having the score in front of us really helps us to see these kind of moments. But again, a device he uses to build energy, to build suspense, and to keep things moving. So yeah, let's see, what else here? Okay, sorry. All right. I've already mentioned that. Okay, so that's kind of just some brief string tools. Now let's get to the kind of the heart of Sibelius's writing, which is the woodwind writing. And in this piece, very, very, very important, very powerful as well. So in general, woodwinds, as a rule, are the most diverse group of instruments. You have very different colors. From a flute to a bassoon, those tone colors are quite different in general in any orchestra. But also the clarinet, the oboe, sometimes the flute, sometimes the bassoon are often talked about as most closely imitating the human voice. That's exactly what Sibelius was always after. He wanted to treat them as unique opportunities and give each one of them the recognition they all deserve as their unique tone qualities suggest. So oftentimes you don't really have woodwind chorales. When you do have woodwind chorales in Sibelius, they're meant to represent literally a human choir of voices. Hint, hint, Finlandia. Hint, hint, most of the times that the woodwinds play together. We'll get to that in a second. But, okay, as we all know, woodwinds have a very strong pastoral imagery associated with them. Beethoven 6, Dvorak 8, Smetana that we just did, birds, pipes, rivers, whatever. We all know that. I mentioned that 6 out of the 9 symphonies begin with woodwinds, and they're usually melodies, solos, or groups of each instrument. So for example, the opening of the 5th symphony that we did not too long ago, it begins with a pair of French horns, with its kind of bursting out into the sunlight figure. I just showed you the opening of Symphony 1, clarinet solo, very, very massively important. Really cool one is the bassoon solo in the development of the 3rd symphony, which is really, really a cool usage of it. I don't know if you know that one, Abigail, but it's a really, really cool symphony for the bassoons in general. But anyway, let's talk about vocal imitation. So as soloists, we talked about that, and choirs as well. Now, Finlandia is really meant to represent the woodwinds as the Finnish people. The woodwinds are the people. And so if you look at, from the very beginning of the symphony, actually, I mentioned letter I here, but let's actually go back to letter A. Look at letter A for me in Finlandia. And we have pretty much all of the woodwinds here playing after this massively powerful brass chorale that opens the piece. Out of nowhere, there's 2 beats of rest, and then a completely different texture and timbre, the woodwind chorale comes in. And it's a very kind of lamenting, sad chorale, if you will, in the woodwinds. And that's literally meant to represent the oppression of the Finnish people over the years. So these brief 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bars are so jam-packed full of emotion. And that's really why he put them there specifically at the beginning of this piece. Okay, fast forward, look at letter B for me. And letter B, one of his favorite instruments was the clarinet because of its particular vocal qualities. Sibelius wrote tons of clarinet solos, but look at what he does here. It's that very, very famous counter melody. At letter B, the 4th bar. A resignation to the struggle. It's the Finnish cry for freedom, for help, for anything. And as a direct response to that, notice what the strings do. Like completely ignore it. We're not going to hear you. Well, look at letter C. Before letter C, we had the exact same clarinet figure, now doubled by the oboes. Even more people are calling for resistance. Even more are feeling oppressed. And what happens? Finally, we break through a little bit, but there's this struggle, there's this tension that keeps happening all the way into letter D. So then look at letter I, the very, very famous, of course, Finlandia hymn, a song of hope and triumph. And that's really kind of what's meant to symbolize and portray. This is, it's often said that this is a folk melody that Sibelius adapted. Not true. He actually composed this. It's his own original composition. He, in fact, didn't want it to be a vocal piece. He wanted it to represent voice, but not actually have voice. He later changed his mind on that. But very, very powerful woodwind chorale here. Today, those of you that are familiar obviously know this. If you go to church, you know this as I think it's "Be Still My Soul" is the hymn, but also there's 2 other settings of this in different denominations of Christianity and different hymnals. So it's still used today, and it's still very, very popularly used as a hymn. Okay, so let's go back and mention that he uses individual pairs of woodwinds, usually playing in thirds or in simple arpeggios. This is a really cool use of this is in the 7th Symphony at the beginning of it. I really want to play that with us one day, by the way. It's a really cool piece if you don't know it. It's in one movement. Anyway, but yeah, if you listen to the opening of the 7th Symphony after we're done, you'll notice how much this flute idea sticks out. Just listen to the first minute of the symphony. You'll know what I'm talking about. Bam, it just cuts right through the texture. This group of 2. And that's a very common thing. He was very, very, let's see here. Oh, Harry, how are you? So he was very, very fond of using specific groups of woodwinds by themselves. Okay, cool. Let's move on to the brass. All right. Harry, well, you joined right in time, man. Perfect. All right. So the brass, a very powerful tool. He uses the brass when he needs to, and when he does, it usually packs a huge punch. The beginning of Finlandia packs a pretty big punch. And he usually uses the brass as a unit, as a big wall of sound. Rarely do you get in Sibelius a brass solo. There are a few exceptions. There's a huge trombone solo in the Seventh Symphony. Bill, I don't know if you're familiar with that one. It's a gorgeous trombone solo. But look at the opening of Finlandia. Just go ahead and look at it for me. How many bars? Pretty much the opening until letter A is all brass, with the exception of a timpani roll. In this moment to really kind of highlight the rumble and the motion throughout that silence. But the brass, massively, massively big here. He uses another device that's very characteristic for the brass in this, long and slow crescendos that usually arrive at a really accented note. So we start with an accented note in the beginning, pa, and then massive, huge crescendo to a forzato. Really, really very common Sibelius tool, but also a very powerful brass figure. Brass, how fun is that to do, first of all? Pretty fun to do, I'd say, right? But also very powerful too as an emotional tool. Notice the beginning chords forte to a forzato, after the two fermata bars, fortissimo, so even more of a punch. Okay, so we see this massive chorale there. Then look at letter D. He doesn't really use the brass after this, right? If you look through and just skip through the pages, rest until letter D, fanfares. These very militaristic fanfares, which actually just, we'll talk about what this D represents later, but again, a very specific usage of it and as a unit, as a section of instruments, all together. Very percussive use. Okay, let's fast forward to letter F. Again, as a wall of tone. This time the trombone has the melody a little bit with, where am I? Yes, with the tuba, but for the most part, a wall of sound again. And so you notice that you start seeing these common things. One really cool moment I like is look at after letter G. The fifth bar of letter G. You can look either in your part or in the score. It's a very cool moment. Remember I mentioned that when he uses trumpets and flutes, that really pops because he doesn't do it often. Here's a perfect example of that. The fifth bar of letter G, the brass have this crescendo, and everyone really does. The trumpets really kind of ring out over the texture here. They're supposed to pierce, like really pierce through the sky with their sound. And notice they're the only ones that move 2 bars later. Well, that crescendo should be also the biggest one of them all. So it's supposed to blend, and all of a sudden out of the texture, we have this bright, brilliant sound. Again, a huge Sibelius tool, but very cool in this piece. A very unique effect as well. Another huge crescendo, 4 before letter I, and I would say the climactic moment of the piece. After all this strife, and we have this buzzing string figure again, at letter H, 2 bars of this massive, massive buildup of string energy, and then a brass chord that comes in piano, 2 bars, crescendo molto, boom, fortissimo. And then what comes after that? All of a sudden, once the texture clears, the chorale, the very famous hymn. There's a reason why the hymn is so powerful, because it's set up so powerfully by those 4 bars before it. And it's often not talked about that those bars actually are the reason why it was probably such a meaningful hymn. But he gives us this massive block of tension. I mean, look at this entire section pretty much from letter, you could argue from letter D to letter I is a one giant buildup to the chords through before I. And notice it's not 2 bars of decrescendo. He gives us 2 bars of crescendo and then 3 bars of diminuendo. A seemingly insignificant little choice, but it's the impact of the chord itself. The chord to be sustained at fortissimo for 1 full bar, kind of signalizing like, hey guys, this is the climax of this piece, and then diminuendo into nothing. So the brass as a whole usually play in massive units and at very structurally important times in the piece. Okay, so we've said that they often do that. They often play solemn chorales, and they're also given the melody very frequently. Again, very similar to Rimsky-Korsakov, who he idealized, and often very similar to Tchaikovsky. We just did Tchaikovsky. I think you can remember there's a lot of trombone solos in that, and also some horn solos in that. An interesting thing is that he often avoids the tuba. Now, not in Finlandia, but as a general rule, he often avoids the tuba. Speculation as to why, there's never really any specific reason why, but most likely either due to its woolly kind of timbre. He loves really clear bass lines, how clear a bass can be, or a cello can be in the low range, how clear a trombone can be. The tuba struggled at that point to be as clear. That's one reason particularly. The other one is his texture is already so dark and low. Why add to it? We don't really need to. So the last group of instruments here that's really cool is the French horns as part of the brass. They have two very specific ideas that make them so unique in Sibelius, and the first one is called a riff, and it's a wrenching kind of shriek. I wrote it here. It's a rising cluster of notes, and if you listen to these two examples here, you'll really see what I'm talking about. But we heard it in Symphony 5. It just sounds like this, almost like a blur out of nowhere, like what just happened? And these are very unique things that the horns can do. I don't know if you guys remember when we did Stravinsky Lullaby and Finale from the Firebird. It's a technique that Stravinsky uses as well. On the harmonics, he just gives us this massive crescendo. Anyway, so that's the brass. Lastly, percussion. Timpani and bass drum are kind of the calling cards of Sibelius' percussion. And if you look at Finlandia, there's timpani and there's bass drum very prominently in this piece. All right, so let's look at the timpani first. They're very extensive parts. They're also very original parts of Sibelius. The first symphony usually is a huge excerpt for timpanists. And he uses three things to really kind of like give timpani their weight. Rolls, usually very, very long rolls. We're talking like not 2-3 bars, we're talking like 20, 24, 32 bar long rolls. The job of a timpanist is to keep the intensity of it going and also listen to the phrasing and kind of go in and out of the phrasing as well. Flams, which are rapid figures that kind of shove music into action. It's usually like it's a three-part motive, like and it just kind of shoves everything, like right in your face. And then usually he often gives a timpani the melody. If he had access to 25 timpani at one point, I'm pretty sure he would write the whole melody and the lower brass out for the timpani as well. Just not possible at that moment in time, but look at letter D and you'll see what I'm talking about. Even though it may seem like it's one just note repeated over and over, it's actually part of the melody with the brass. And he does this very often. He combines timpani with brass. Bass drum, along with Mahler, these two are probably the most important composers for the bass drum. You could argue Verdi, yes, I know, but really these two, and specifically symphonic music, are so important. So look at letter L for me, specifically in the full score if you have it. And you'll notice a direction there. At letter L, it says gran casa con bacchette di timpani, which means bass drum played with the mouth of a timpani. So this is meant to have the effect of a timpani roll on the bass drum. Now, why is that important? He treats it as a solo instrument here, and he really wants to have even more of a lower rumble. If he can have timpani without pitch, he would use it, and that's his choice to do that. So really, the bass drum has to be treated as a timpani in this moment. Really cool effect. Really, really cool effect. All right, so again, just like the brass, he uses the percussion only when he needs to and in really specific moments, which just highlight them even more. So there's a lot of unique things that Sibelius does, and I'm pretty sure by even just talking about it, as we did just now, that we covered the majority of this piece. So let's actually now walk through the piece really quickly. Before we do that, though, I want to tell you, when this piece premiered, when it was actually a part of 7 little pieces. How many of you knew that? I'm just curious, show of hands. It was premiered as a set of 7. It was the last in a group of 7. How many of you, let me see. No. All right. Well, there you go. You learned something today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. But yeah, it was meant as, it was played as the 7th piece of a tableau of Historical episodes, they were called. Historical episodes. Again, supposed to highlight Finnish history. The last one, Finlandia, except it wasn't called Finlandia at that point. Very important. At that point, the piece was called Finland Awakes, or Awakens, however you want to translate it. Very different title, isn't it? And it was meant to literally say, this country is awaking, which is why this piece is so powerful, which is why the chorale and the hymn, that letter I, is so important, because it symbolized the birth of a nation. And hopefully that was made clear in our brief history lesson at the beginning of this. But so after the initial premiere, which by the way, the original piece was called Press Celebration Music. Awesome name, okay. The reason why, and Sibelius wrote these 7 little vignettes to support a group of journalists that were censored by the Russian government. And he wrote this as a support for them, like, hey, we're with you, we hear you, and you're not alone. And so each little vignette had a different episode in history, the last one being, don't worry guys, we're gonna have our own thing a little bit here. But in the next year or two, this piece was played several times, and because automatically it was seen as this kind of vehicle for nationalism, they knew it was going to be censored, so they had alternate titles that Sibelius gave it. These alternate titles, pretty important, and I'll tell you what they are. The first one is Happy Feelings of Awakening of Finnish Springtime. It's a long title, and I wouldn't, Happy Feelings, really? Like the whole piece is not, anyway. The second one is Scandinavian Choral March. Okay, but again, these 2 other titles, along with Finland Awakens, they tell a very specific kind of imagery that Sibelius had in mind for this. The idea of a country coming to life, awakening. Happy Feelings of Awakening, again, of Finnish springtime. Okay, does that name sound familiar, by the way? Like it sounds like anything specifically? Like any other piece we may have played before in the Summerville Orchestra? It's supposed to represent the 2nd movement of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. Happy Feelings of Arrival in the Countryside. Happy Feelings of Awakening of Finnish Spring. So these 2 titles are very, very linked. They are absolutely, absolutely linked together. And the Scandinavian Choral March. So it's supposed to represent kind of all of Scandinavia in a way. I think really he called it that to kind of avoid censorship by calling it Finnish Choral March. That might be a little precarious, but if you call it Scandinavian Choral March, nobody's gonna ask many questions. But again, the word choral is very important because when this piece premiered, there was no chorus, there was no text. So the word choral clearly indicates that Sibelius had an image of human voices when he was writing this piece. So that being said, any questions at this point in time? If you have a question, just type it out in the chat box or raise your hand or just go ahead and blurt it out. Anybody got one? Before we dive into the piece really quickly? All right, well, without further ado, let's just dive in. So we mentioned that this piece is the historical summary of an oppressed nation through time and eventually coming into its own. And that's really the best way to summarize it. Okay, well, let's talk about this opening first for a second. Pretty dark, pretty ominous, pretty crazy opening. In fact, I'm gonna just now move to my piano so I can demonstrate certain things for you and so you can hear them, specifically the opening of this. Join me, if you will, through a brief tour through my house. All right, cool. So, oh, run these up. All right, what's up, buddy? Okay, so let's talk about this very opening chord and the reason why it's so powerful. Let's talk about the key signature first. The key signature is 0 sharps, 0 flats. Automatically, that means we have one of 2 possibilities. It's either in A minor or in C major. Okay, well, what's the first chord? An F sharp minor in 2nd inversion. Oh, okay, cool. So pretty much the furthest possible point from C major you can get to. And how do we know it's in C major? Look at the very last chord before letter A. It's actually a C major chord. The only way we know that is trumpet 3. The trumpet 3 is the only one that has the major third interval at this moment in time. But the rest of it is meant to summarize absolute uncertainty and absolute tension. So we go from this F sharp minor chord to that chord, which is a very strange chord too. No real sense of resolution, is there? I mean, you don't really get a feeling like we've arrived somewhere. That is a German sixth chord, a German augmented sixth chord. Now, what does that mean? It's basically a vehicle to get into the dominant, which the dominant is the fifth. But, so that would mean that if we go from here to here, that's the fifth. That's where it should go, technically. It should go from here. And that's how we get back to C major. Is that where it goes? Mm-mm. Just to A major out of all places. So very, very, very unique opening, meant to convey a lot of tension, a lot of massive, massive, massive impact as well. We talked about the brass, we talked about the crescendos that they represent. So obviously a very emotionally opening piece. Okay, so this whole chorale is absolutely stunning music. Follow along with each chord to really see how impactful the harmony is here. But okay, what happens at letter A? We have all of a sudden this chorale in the woodwinds. Okay, very different range. We talked about that this represents the Finnish population, the human choir. It's the voices of the oppressed calling out in agony. It really is. That's a pretty dramatic way of saying it, but it really is. It's the cries of a nation that's been kind of beaten down over the years. And you can tell in just, it's a forte, but it's not the same kind of weight or power that the brass have, is it? You just simply can't match that kind of level of power and sound. And the woodwinds, even though they may try, they don't have enough voices, they don't have enough power, they don't have enough anything to really make themselves as powerful as that. So really, they can't rise against the brass before them. Okay, well, to answer these plaintive calls, we have the strings. A few bars later, strings given this melody on this very dark, rich sound. What does that sound like? And that's a rhetorical question, but it should sound like Russian music. It should sound very much like a Tchaikovsky or a Rimsky-Korsakov melody. That's no accident. It's supposed to represent the Russian occupation. And given to the strings, very specifically, remember he specifically chooses moments he gives the strings the melody, very important times. Here's one of them. To represent Russian music and Russian oppression of Finland. This is not meant to be a Russian bashing session. I'm just simply saying this is Sibelius' feelings and the feelings of Finland as a country. That's all I'm saying. But pretty literal, and anyone who would be familiar with Russian music at that time would know that it's a direct representation of that. Well, let's jump ahead to letter B. The woodwinds, the humans try again, the Finns try again to make themselves known, to get their voices heard, right? And it's this, again, this beautiful kind of melody. And then clarinets here. Absolutely stunningly gorgeous, gorgeous melody, but did it feel like we got any sense of resolution? No, it was a cry for help, but all of a sudden, again, the strings meant to represent them silenced. The woodwinds are completely silenced again. Okay, well, let's try again. Okay. Oh, hope. Okay. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. So there's now more of a dialogue. Now there's more of a melodic line in the woodwinds here. that's going somewhere. And now they're joined by the strings at letter C, and it's this kind of tussle. It's this unstable mess of chords that doesn't actually ever go anywhere, kind of like the beginning, but kind of not. And if you look at the chords that they have here at this spot, it's this collection of these unstable tonalities. Okay, well, hang on. We just got to a resolution point. Should be the resolution, but it keeps going. Okay. Another resolution here. Nope. Now we're going to get to letter D and finally probably end this whole thing. Whoa, what the heck happened? All right, now we have the actual fight for freedom. Letter D is supposed to represent the literal fight for freedom. And how do we know that? The activity that's happening on top of the brass. Again, remember the powerfully chosen moment for the brass to come in to give us fanfares directly representing what? The militaristic struggle in a minor chord. Okay, over and over and over. Again, another one. Meant to highlight the last two specific wars that they had. We mentioned in 1809 that Finland went over to Russia. There was really two wars that caused that. It's a little bit of a nod to that. But anyway, we get on. Okay, let's talk about that moment before E, because that's really kind of like the beginning. That half-step motion. Well, here we have the same thing. So he combines the opening motive with this motive here before E in this strife and struggle scene. And it not only joins the beginning to this section, but it paints a very, again, emotionally charged moment with even more weight to it. So this goes on for a while. Then there's the whole buzzing thing. That whole thing, blah, 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 blah. There's a struggle, there's a fight, there's a fight, there's a fight, there's more melodies. And this really, again, goes all the way towards letter G. We mentioned the giant crescendo in the fifth bar of G. The first part where the harmony really changes for the first time since letter D to now. Okay? And then trumpets soar over the texture there in the fifth bar of G. And it's meant to represent that something's actually finally changing. Okay, well, we get to this massive chord before letter I. All right, so we get this giant, juicy chord before we get to this almost an amen cadence, if you will. It's with a suspension, but very, very unique chord again there. And the chord before letter I, before that chorale, let me see if I can find it here. I'm actually playing off a piano reduction that Sibelius himself arranged in the year 1900. But after all of that, we arrive at an A flat major chord. So how different? We started this piece on an F sharp minor chord, kind of, and we arrive at a C major. But then we get to C minor at letter G. And now A flat major. If you look at Sibelius's music, the chord, specifically the sonority of A flat major, has a very heroic quality to it. If you look at the Lemminkainen suites, the Kullervo Symphony, Karelia Suite, a lot of heroic moments in Sibelius's music feature A major. This is kind of a nod to Mozart. Mozart chose specific keys for very specific purposes. So again, we talked about Sibelius's German training. There's a perfect nod to Mozart and Beethoven in that regard. His choice of key. We end up finally on this A flat, beautiful sonority. And then we have A flat, a very heroic key. And it's also meant to symbolize hope and triumph. So finally, after all this strife and fighting, the 5 bars before I, let's calm down. Let's simmer down. All right, so we get to this chorale, which is kind of speaks for itself. But look at letter M. The strife comes back. The fight for oppression comes back. And this is because the battle's not won. It's meant to symbolize that even though in our minds and our hearts, we know what our end goal is, we're still fighting and we haven't gotten there yet. And letter M is often done faster than the section before it in many recordings. This is very, very correct because it should, again, symbolize this energy, this renewed sense of energy. But notice even in this static, well, arguably static chorale at letter I, he doesn't just switch the texture to this like kind of just long chords. Which is something that maybe Schumann or Brahms could have done, maybe give it a little bit of a triplet feel. They probably would have done that, but what does Sibelius do? Look at the string writing at letter I. Constant energy, constant motion. It never ceases to stop moving because it's never really done. Again, the battle is not quite won yet. And this is a gentle reminder throughout this whole section that there's still an energy left in this piece. Well, we get to this renewed sense of struggle, almost an ABA, if you will. If you look at letter G as a starting point, and the rest before as an introduction, it's really an ABA, the struggle, the hymn, the struggle. All right, then we get to this point at letter N. By the way, really cool thing at letter N, that's very different. The original version of Finlandia at letter N to the end was very, very, very different. There's actually a really cool link on YouTube I'll try to find for you all that has the original ending to this. It's very, very different. It's also very interesting to listen to and to compare why Sibelius changed it the way he did. So I'll send it to you all, but again, notice we're still in A flat major, and all of a sudden in the 5th bar of letter N, we get to what? An E major chord out of nowhere, meant to represent the final pivotal moment of victory. We have a bit more struggle, and then all of a sudden, the last 7 bars of the piece, the allargando to the end, what section takes over? Or sorry, not 7 before the end, O to the end. What section again takes over? The brass. The section that began this whole thing in this very tense now takes over and gives us an absolutely stunningly gorgeous chorale to the end of the piece. Right? Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful chorale there. I was playing from the full score, and that did not work out very well, but I think you get what I'm trying to do there at letter O. So the very section that began with such punch, packed full of power, ends it with as much power, but in the completely different vein, a very positive, triumphant, hopeful vein. And so that concludes our brief foray through Finlandia. Really a 7 or 8 minute piece that is just jam-packed full of drama, emotion, but also Sibelius as a composer that's kind of packed into this 8-minute gift to us. And often it's said that Finlandia is the jumping off point of Finnish music. What is Finnish music? Really, as a country, Finland didn't exist, nor did they have a really strong musical tradition like Germany did, like Austria-Hungary did, like Russia did. There really was no such thing as Finnish music. And the reason why we associate Sibelius with the rise of Finnish music is because of how uniquely he blended the elements of Russian, German, his own native ideas, folk music, folk literature, the phrasing and the usage of syllabic structure in the Finnish language, put them all into his own thing and created a very unique language. We mentioned a lot of the devices he uses in the orchestra, in different sections of the orchestra, and they come into full display in Finlandia. And really this piece is often compared to Ma Vlast, which we just did the Moldau from Ma Vlast by Smetana. It's often compared to that as the same kind of cultural weight, nationalistic weight, whatever you want to call it. But what Sibelius did in 8 minutes took Smetana 80 minutes to do, arguably. You could really kind of have the debate. But all in all, it encapsulates everything that Sibelius is as a composer, everything the nation was feeling at the moment. It gave them a powerful hymn of independence. It's very powerful for so many different reasons. And for us as performers, I hope that this helped you all not only understand the piece more, but understand the composer more, but also give you meaning to each measure of this piece. Because what may on paper look insignificant, like it's just a trill, like, oh, it's just a C to a D flat, not really important. Well, it actually really is in the language of Sibelius. So I wanted to just give you some ideas, some context clues, some tools to help you discover this piece, maybe rediscover it again. The last thing I will say is to really understand him as a composer more, really listen to his first symphony. It's absolutely stunning. You'll see a lot of these same devices come into play, written in the same exact year. Yeah, and one thing I want to mention is this book right here. If you are fans of Sibelius, this book is a must-have. It is an absolute treasure. It is by David Hurwitz. There's the author there. And it is called Sibelius, the Orchestral Works, an Owner's Manual. It basically goes through his musical language, tells you a bit about who he is as a composer. Then he goes through each one of the symphonies and his big works, his theater works, his tone poems, etc., etc. Again, we haven't even touched the symphonies today, not really the point. We haven't touched the tone poems, not the point. We can have endless discussions on Sibelius, my favorite composer. I think that's pretty clear by now, but this was meant as just a brief fun foray into a piece that is arguably has been overplayed in the past, but hopefully this gives you some new tools and language to make this fresh, to make it a new piece, to help you understand it, help you approach it from a different perspective. So with that being said, what I'd love for us all to do is, I mentioned the chat function earlier at the beginning of the video. If you could now use that chat function, and you'll have an option there. There should be a bubble there that says to everyone, or you can pick specific people that you want to send a message to. If anyone has any questions, go ahead and type those out there in case that, like, if you, like, what I'm going to do is open it up to the floor now. And if you have a question, you'll ask it. But in case we can't get to you or something, I want to make sure that we at least put it on paper. So if you have one, you can ask it. And then I'd love to get to them all. So that being said, if you have a question, go ahead and you can unmute yourself, or I can unmute you. You can raise your hand. I'm not sure what the best way to do this is. We're going to figure this out as we go. But if you have any questions, now is a good time. Let's hear it. Anyone? Did I cover it perfectly? No questions.
Hey, no question, but thank you very much. It is kind of interesting how Russia inspired so many composers to write their nationalism in music. Yes. Shostakovich, Tchaikovsky, just amazing. Just some beautiful really, works that came out of that struggle with Russia.
Yeah, and once again, we see the impact that Rimsky-Korsakov has on not only composers, but musical language, orchestration. If you're not familiar with a lot of his music, please go and listen to it, first of all. It's a 99% chance that we're going to do Scheherazade next year with the orchestra, which is a massive work. It's about 43 minutes long, but it tells a specific story in 1001 Nights, but it is basically all the things that Sibelius got from Rimsky-Korsakov jam-packed into one piece. His choice of orchestration, his melodic writing, his folk writing, etc. It's just amazing to me too how much it has inspired countless generations of composers today. Anyone else have a question before we go? No? So I want to say thank you. I know this is a new time for us, 5:30 on a Wednesday. The goal for this is to have these on at least through April, to have them on Monday and Wednesdays at 5:30. And they're going to be about an hour long. This one has been about an hour long. And each one of them is going to pick a different piece. So if we get through all of our rep for April and May in those times, I may pick specific ones. We may just do a general one. We may do a different topic altogether. I will take all requests if wanted or needed. So with that being said,
I have a question.
Yes. What's up, Josh?
Yeah. Well, actually, it's a comment. What I had to say, I find interesting how Sibelius blended all the orchestral works, like far as like the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, German, especially with a country that's rise up out of the ashes, and kind of it's parallels like the same to both of the nation. We look at like the old version of the film and the new version of the film.
Yeah.
It just had the symbology.
Yes,
that's quite interesting.
And it's funny that you say that you use the phrase "birth of a nation" because we haven't even talked about the significance that this has had as a hymn around the world. Does everybody know Joan Baez, by the way, singer-songwriter Joan Baez? So funnily enough, I guess you could say, she has used Finlandia as the opening to her concert since 2007. Not often well known. Also, Finlandia as a hymn has been used as literally the national anthem. The country doesn't exist anymore, but a very short stint as a country, Biafra in Africa. The country of Biafra used Finlandia as its national anthem for a while. If you go to Wales and Ireland, two of their most patriotic pieces, I guess, are set to this music of Finlandia, the hymn from it. So to this day, I haven't even talked about any of the other things, but if you're curious, do a little digging online, research the piece itself, and you'll see how much of a cultural impact it's had, not only on Finland and its composers, but around the world. It's pretty remarkable. So if no one else has a question, I guess we can adjourn, and we'll meet again on a Monday at 5:30. Verdi's Nabucco is on the docket for Monday. Verdi's Nabucco. So, any questions? Thank you all so much for joining. I hope this is a good time that works for everyone. Let me know, send me an email, send me a text, send me a Facebook message, whatever you want. Let me know if this is a good time. If you've heard that it's not a good time, I'm curious about your feedback. So until then, we'll see you all on Monday. Thank you also for joining, and hopefully this was fun and informative and all the above. So
thank you, Wojciech.
Take care.
Thank you, Mr. Muliski.
Stay safe. Stay safe. Take care, everyone.